Good morning and welcome to the launch of Strategic Survey 2016, the annual review of world affairs. I'll say a few words at the beginning and then I'll ask some of my colleagues on the stage to add a few words in their specific areas of expertise, and then, as usual, we'll open it up for questions and answers. In our view, the underpinnings of geopolitics have splintered so much in the past year that the foundations of global order appear alarmingly weak. The year was characterized by a bad-tempered roar against political arrangements seen to be unfair, concocted by others, and out of touch with the current realities of international power or the prevailing winds of domestic sentiment. In this environment, foreign policy became, and will continue to be in 2017, a branch of psychology, managing competing interests or settling neat balances of power. These clinical tasks of the geopolitician will be superseded by the need to cope with countries who want their natural position restored, their historical rights as they define them accepted, their return to normalcy acknowledged, their exceptionalism catered to, and their ideology and worldview respected. The politics of parochialism now mix with the instincts of nationalism, and both clash with the cosmopolitan world order so carefully constructed by the technocrats of the late 20th century. The result is more significant than a popular backlash against the forces of globalization, with its attendant nostalgic yearnings for a simpler past. Multiple strategic earthquakes have created a situation in which world leaders are in a constant state of crisis control. The institutions that have been created to contain crises are being bypassed or have shown themselves incapable, with the result that conflict management has become renationalized. Unilateralism is a preferred mode of conduct. Stealing a march on the slow-paced, deliberative processes of others has become the main strategic gambit. Russia's foray into Syria, China's activities in the South China Sea, the interventions of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in Yemen, where Iran too was active, all reflected a new go-it-alone geopolitical trend, and so too did the UK's vote to leave the European Union. With no effective global or regional balances of power to constrain unilateralism, and a pervasive distrust in the ability of institutions to protect national and regional interests, these types of individual actions will continue to multiply. Regional institutions, the European Union, ASEAN, the GCC, and others are fracturing. Global and regional groupings are under threat as governments struggle to show that they are closer to the concerns of the people over whom they rule and less beholden to international constructs seen increasingly at odds with national interests. It may be that a renationalization of politics comforts domestic opinion. It does, however, put into reverse efforts of the last half-century to channel political disputes and differences through institutional arrangements. The next year will likely see more shuffling of the geopolitical deck of cards, an extension of the strategic unease that set in last year, and a frantic drive by major powers in all regions to set new rules of the game and revive old ones. In this context, the apparent strategic dynamism of the East will superficially contrast with persistent strategic arthritis in the West. But on the whole, the net result will be a grinding of the geopolitical tectonic plates with no new geopolitical settlement in the offing. China continued in 2016 to mark its strategic arrival on the world stage with a more persistent and assertive foreign policy. By one estimate, China reclaimed at least 17 times more land in the South China Sea than all other claimant states combined. It continued to insist that territorial disputes be solved bilaterally and not by institutions. It rejected the authority of the UN's Permanent Court of Arbitration to rule on its dispute with the Philippines, and regularly sought to peel away ASEAN states from any settled consensus on how to engage with China on thorny territorial issues. A champion of multipolarity at the global level, China will continue to strongly emphasize bilateralism in its Asian regional diplomacy. It has also, in its own way, taken the regional issues that affect its core interests to the global stage. While China has always carefully monitored international adherence to the One China policy and punished those who over-empathize with Tibetans, its stance in the South China Sea has now risen to assume equal foreign policy prominence. States everywhere have been cautioned not to do anything that appears to challenge China's sovereign claims in the region. China is not quite yet seeking to build an alternative world order, but it is backing its own institutions, widening its geopolitical ambitions beyond Asia, and engaging in a firmer diplomacy of command, by which it seeks to insist with ever greater firmness that its views be fully taken into account. These are the natural actions of a nascent world power. Unlike previous superpowers, though, there is no sign that China wishes to export its political system or values, nor is it likely to develop policies aimed at providing global public goods. It will not seek to create or lead an alliance system, but instead to expand an arc of influence in Asia and well beyond. Russia in the last year has continued on the more assertive and confrontational path that it took with the annexation of Crimea. In the year to mid-2016, it asserted itself further along its border with NATO states and made itself a key player in the Levant through support for President Bashar al-Assad of Syria. Despite Russian frustration with Assad and the cost of shoring him up, Moscow sees no alternative and feels that its decision has netted strategic gains in the Middle East at the expense of the United States. In Europe, the Cold War-like period of tensions in Russia-West relations has now acquired a momentum that will prove impossible to reverse in the short to medium term. Policy decisions taken in 2016 will ensure the mutual remilitarization of the NATO-Russia frontier in northeastern Europe continues unabated. This increasing concentration of forces on both sides of the NATO-Russia divide, in the absence of robust communication and confidence-building regimes, reduces decision-making time while increasing the possibility of misunderstanding, misinterpretation, or accident. While 2016 saw initial attempts to negotiate mechanisms for managing risks associated with all this very close contact, it remains unclear whether Moscow is prepared to back down from its brinkmanship, which came in response to NATO's increased presence along its borders, unless that increase is somehow limited or reversed. If recently the future of Europe was being discussed in the context of a resurgent nationalist Russia and the Greek debt crisis, the UK vote to leave the EU in the 23 June referendum portends the biggest change in European politics for a generation. Brexit will change the European Union as much as it will change the UK's relationship with the Union. British Prime Minister Theresa May has accepted the instruction of the British people to leave the EU, but what that entails is unclear and contested. No arrangement that any other non-EU state has with the EU is likely to form a useful template, and the 27 cannot be blind to the risk that a successful Brexit might pose an existential threat to the Union. Stripping the emotion out of the divorce talks will be no easy task. While much of the negotiations will be highly technical, the strategic implications will need to be kept in constant view. We are gone, and good riddance will preferably not be enduring negotiating postures. The aim must be to develop a new economic and political partnership. Yet there is no guarantee that these talks will succeed, as so many interests and constituencies have to be satisfied. As the established structures of Europe are being shaken, the Middle East continues to prosecute its multiple civil wars while coping with a changed economic and fiscal environment. The Islamic State is progressively less a state defending clear front lines and more a guerrilla movement mounting surprise attacks and terrorist bombings at home and abroad. It is likely to do as much damage when it is losing as when it was winning, including in Europe. Robust U.S. intervention in the Middle East various conflicts remains unlikely. The temptations for military engagement other than in a supportive role are likely to be resisted. The U.S. rebalance to Asia has become an established mantra and necessary to America's self-image as a resident power in the Asia-Pacific. The commitments made to European security through NATO have a structural and institutionalized quality to them that lends weight to the aims of reassurance and deterrence so central to U.S. policy. Still, the world will keenly await the direction that the U.S. takes in 2017 under a new president. When Obama was first elected in 2008, he was initially received as a potentially healing and uniting global force. Relatively quickly, the great weight of expectations placed on his presidency, of course, proved untenable. The power of the U.S. has declined, but it remains the geopolitical swing player, in the sense that if it chooses to act decisively, it can still make a difference, but if it chooses to abstain, its absence from a conflict or a diplomatic engagement will also be felt deeply. The age of U.S. indispensability is perhaps drawing to a close. The U.S. electoral process in 2016 threw up, as was the case in European politics, the concerns of the disaffected and a desire for retrenchment that may in future limit America's diplomatic extroversion. Making judgments on foreign policy trends in the West in the current environment is hugely contingent. Electoral politics in the West have an insurgent quality to them. The domestic license for expansive, open, engaged international relations is limited and appears difficult to renew. The politics of protectionism are on the rise. The scope for strategic thinking and action is shrinking. A sense of strategic malaise is pervasive. The message that globalization has not been good for everyone and that there is an unacceptable gap between ruling elites and the people they govern is clear. Political and business authority needs to reconnect with people. Once greater confidence is achieved on the home front, perhaps a new effort at intergovernmental institution building can take place. One must hope that there is not much delay in renewing that effort, as a world that doubts its regional and global institutions is a world in drift. And with those formal remarks, let me perhaps pass to the panel for 4 informal remarks on different areas of the world. Adam Ward, Director of Studies, perhaps a bit on China and Asia. Adam Ward.
Thank you, John. In Asia, Chinese assertiveness, we think, has been driven by domestic and external factors. The Xi Jinping government is different from recent collective leaderships. There's been a centralization of power in Xi's hands, confirmed by anti-corruption drives, ideological campaigns, clampdowns, and a boost in his position as commander-in-chief of the PLA. Xi has more power than his predecessors, but he also has the temperament to use it. And there's an element of compulsion too. Nationalism is an important galvanizer as China settles into a pattern of slower growth. An assertive foreign policy will be de rigueur as China heads into the November 2017 Party Congress, when new members of the Politburo Standing Committee have to be appointed. Xi will want to emerge from the factional maneuverings flanked with new allies, but even if he faces checks and balances, it's hard to see decisive change in foreign policy. Chinese assertiveness has also been fed by the narrative of the strategic incompetence of the West. The period since 9/11 is seen in China as a succession of geopolitical blunders. The economic frailties of the US and the Eurozone have been laid bare. This has opened a strategic window of opportunity for China. A mainstream view of the US pivot is of a declining superpower gathering its reduced resources for an attempted containment. There's been international receptivity to geoeconomic initiatives like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Belt and Road Initiative, but also suspicions about underlying political motives attached. In the South China Sea, China has moved with breathtaking speed, but neighbors have been jolted into more ambitious defense modernization plans, and demand for the US presence has grown. ASEAN, to which China used to pay punctilious attention, has resented what it sees as attempts to divide its membership and throw an already drifting body into further confusion. China's exasperation with North Korea may have grown, but its fundamental calculus towards Pyongyang oscillating between necessary strategic buffer and better the devil you know, remains unchanged. The strategic bill here includes ballistic missile deployments in South Korea, Japan's normalizing regional defense stature, and closer coordination between US allies. Russia is more dependent on Beijing and more compliant as a supplier of energy and arms technology, but its adventures in Crimea and Syria have made it look a rather erratic and belligerent strategic partner to whom no blank checks should be issued. In Taiwan, Beijing couldn't prevent the election of the presidential candidate of the independence-minded political tradition, so the cross-strait dispute seems back on the map. China and the US can't agree a strategic concept for interaction. The South China Sea casts them in mirrored indignation. Both see themselves as upholding inviolable principles and urgent practical interests. The dispute has the traits of a classic security dilemma. The effects of the US presidential election here are difficult to gauge. Trump's antipathy towards US allies in Asia points to growing strategic disinterest and detachment. But a disruptive unraveling of US positions would not be in China's interests, nor would be Trump's advertised trade fight with Beijing. Hillary Clinton would offer Beijing continuity, but no prospect of comfort. China and the US would continue to play a long game of competition, and the small and the middle powers of Asia will have a more delicate task in the year ahead in trying to leverage that competition for their own ends or avoid getting squashed in its vice. Thank you.
Adam, thank you very much. Nick Redmond.
Thank you. I thought I'd make a few comments about the drivers of Russian policy and what Russia wants. Key to understanding why Russia is acting as the way it is now is the belief that has taken hold in the past few years that the US and its key allies are hostile and duplicitous and ultimately out to get Vladimir Putin. Regime change, color revolutions, whether they be in Syria or Libya or Ukraine or Georgia, are all ultimately viewed as dry runs for the operation on Russia itself. Russia is driven by a mingled sense of insecurity and frustrated entitlement. The insecurity arises from the military encroachment of Western structures deep into Eastern Europe and also from US military modernization across the board. The frustrated sense of entitlement is derived from the encroachment of the EU as well as NATO and other Western institutions deep into Eastern Europe again. There is a desire for recognition as a global power and for the respect that should be accorded to it, part of which is not to be lectured on the deficiencies or otherwise of one's domestic system. And there is a conviction that Western models are not superior to Russia's model and indeed aren't right for Russia. Many of the comments that Adam made in terms of the Chinese analysis of the merits and demerits of Western systems apply also in the Russian case. The Syria intervention, therefore, was about many of these things, to show that US attempts to isolate Russia were futile and to force the United States to resume direct military-to-military contact, to put Russia at the center of regional diplomacy, and ultimately to prevent another case of regime change, which, as I noted, is helpful on the home front for Russia also. What does Russia want? A return in terms of international security management and how international law is practiced and observed to a pre-1993 understanding of those things, with the state first at the center and limited rights of intervention. Respect for its own sphere of influence, and I would note here that Russia is less worried than a year ago about losing Ukraine. And crucially, a comprehensive new European security treaty and construct to reflect some of the many changes that have taken place and to give Russia an equal voice and equal footing. What it's getting at the moment falls far short of this. Quarantined cooperation, firstly on Iran, now on Syria, although as we're seeing, not very much of that. Discussion on Ukraine, albeit linked, albeit in a rather transactional manner, and nothing more. Hence our conclusion that the descent into Cold War-like tensions cannot be reversed in the short to medium term.
Thank you very much. And on the Middle East, Emil Hokayem.
This is the year where diplomatic efforts have been frustrated, if not defeated, a bit everywhere in the Middle East by battlefield developments and regional tensions and divisions. It seems unlikely that sustainable political settlements can be reached in Syria, Libya, Yemen, or Iraq. Of course, in Libya there has been a UN effort that produced a government, but if anything, what happened since then has shown that even an internationally supported and brokered deal is very hard to translate on the ground into something sustainable that tames or rallies the various actors at play. So the humanitarian costs and the security repercussions of these conflicts continue to rise, and unfortunately it's very difficult to predict an improvement on any of these fronts. The Russian intervention in Syria has shaped the battlefield and the diplomacy. A year ago, when we met for Strategic Survey 2015, there was a big question mark about whether the Russian effort could deliver anything. And I would argue that actually it has profoundly shaped the dynamics in Syria, but also shaped the perceptions and the calculations of various Middle East actors. Moscow, contrary to the hopes of many, stands fully behind Assad, and there's very little sign that in the short to medium term it is willing to part with him or even to moderate his military behavior. The strategy of Russia, Iran, and the Assad regime is to win the cities and depopulate them, which is perhaps the main driver for the refugee, which is certainly the main driver for the refugee crisis we witness today. In Syria, Assad has neutralized the strategic threat to the regime in the short term, and Russia has raised the costs for external intervention, or has actually decisively deterred external intervention. So the current discussion about what to do with Aleppo comes a bit too late if one is really concerned about the human cost there. The Syrian rebellion is losing the cities, in part because of a successful regime strategy of starving and besieging rebel areas. And the rebellion is in danger of becoming a rural insurgency that it will likely be more radical and more difficult to support operationally and politically. Russia is now a central player in the Middle East as countries adapt to perceived US retrenchment and hedge. Look for as many potential strategic partners as possible. The question in many Arab cities is whether what they have now is an Obama problem or a US problem. They'll figure out the response to that question in a couple of months once the US elections is decided. But in the meantime, they have to basically hedge as much as they can. And Moscow has become a frequent place, capital that Arab and Middle Eastern leaders visit as a result. The Saudi-Iranian rivalry in this context has become the main operative fault line in the region. It plays out in diplomatic backrooms, the UN and other places, on battlefields across the region, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. When I say directly and indirectly, I don't mean for a second that Iran and Saudi Arabia are facing each other militarily, but in terms of direct intervention, Iran directly intervenes in Syria and Saudi directly intervenes in Yemen. But it also takes place, that rivalry, it's actually fought in op-ed pages in Western newspapers, which shows you to what extent the West remains central to these countries' diplomatic posture. They both want to convince the American, British, French, German publics that they are the better allies, and then that these countries should stand by them. And finally, the weakening of ISIS is undeniable today. ISIS is shrinking in terms of the territory it controls and the population it controls, and in terms of the armament it has, in terms of the flow of foreign fighters and funding, etc. But that weakening also shows challenges ahead. The first one is that ISIS remains a very dangerous and potentially more dangerous actor on other battlefields. ISIS may well become another rural insurgency, roaming groups of jihadis mounting attacks here and there. But perhaps more importantly, the weakening of ISIS reveals fault lines that somehow we hoped had been tamed or been pushed back between the various actors. ISIS was everyone's enemy and everyone was ISIS's enemy. But ISIS was no one's real priority. If you look at the Turkish intervention in Syria today, it's primarily motivated by the need to contain Kurdish expansionism. There are several examples of that. So the fight against ISIS, contrary to what Washington hoped, has not served as the organizing principle of regional politics. It's just been a chapter, and the various actors are preparing for the next chapter where all these long rivalries will probably express themselves in pretty destructive ways. No good news, apologies.
Thank you very much. Well, Virginia Comely, perhaps a bit on Latin America, where there has been a bit of good news, and also on Africa.
Yes,
Virginia.
thank you, John. And in fact, I want to start by bringing some optimism to the panel. There were two major breakthroughs in Latin America over the past year. The first one concerns Colombia. Following 52 years of conflict and 4 years of peace negotiations, finally, the Colombian government and the FARC signed a bilateral ceasefire in June. And yesterday, President Juan Manuel Santos and Timoshenko, the leader of the FARC, finally signed a peace deal. So now the FARC is to become a political party, and former fighters are to be moved to disarmament camps set up by the United Nations. Of course, many efforts are now required to address the challenges of the post-conflict situation, but this was no doubt a landmark development. The second breakthrough in Cuba. We saw over the past year a process of rapprochement between the United States and Cuba. President Obama visited Havana, and in his words, he went there to bury the last remnants of the Cold War in the Americas. So with Cuba no longer seen as a national security problem by the U.S., there are some important implications for U.S. engagement across Central America and the Caribbean. Already we are seeing that U.S. engagement on security and development issues has now reached its highest level since the 1980s. All these changes have happened amidst a shift in the regional strategic landscape. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to understand the situation or the political situation across the region. From the early 2000s, left-leaning governments had more or less dominated the scene in the region, and with them their resistance to globalization and US influence. What we see today is countries adopting a more pragmatic approach, getting closer to the US, and often electing center or center-right governments. Of course, there are some notable exceptions, such as Venezuela. So what we are seeing is a significant political turmoil over the past year and the appointments of new heads of state. It's quite notable to see that presidential approval ratings had in fact dramatically fell across the whole region, from Brazil with the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff to Argentina, where elections brought to power the first non-Peronista president in 14 years, Mauricio Macri. And in addition, the region has also suffered from global economic trends such as the fall in commodity prices and also the slowdown of the Chinese economy. And these problems, together with the many persistent and acute security challenges experienced in places such as Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, mean the countries across the region are very much focused on domestic agendas, and they have little appetite now for engagement on the international scene.
Virginia, thank you very much. Got about 30 minutes for questions. Yes, let me take you first, please.
Thank you. Dominic Dudley, Gulf States News. I'd like to ask about Saudi Arabia and Yemen. There's a relative failure in Yemen. Does that make it likely they'll be more cautious in acting on the international stage going forward? And where do you see that going at? And is the UK and US, are they likely to review or even reduce their support for Saudi at any time in the future in Yemen? Thanks.
Emil Hukayem.
Sure. The Saudi Emirati intervention faces a very harsh reality, which is it's unable to translate military advances, which are happening, into political leverage that can be translated into something during political negotiations. That's in large part because the Houthi insurgency is battle-hardened, survives on very little, and does have significant support inside Yemen. So it's very difficult for Saudi Arabia to define exactly, what victory would look like. So a lot of the current escalation and violence, I think, is driven by frustration. At the same time, one has to recognize that Saudi Arabia has been diplomatically has actually offered a lot more than people expect. Very positive pronouncement by Adel Jubeir toward the Houthis. Quite good offers on the table. But the conditions aren't there. And fundamentally, there's a big disconnect between the military campaign and the negotiations. There's a sense that the US in particular is interested in a real de-escalation in Yemen, in part because of the corrosive debate in Washington and elsewhere about US and UK support for the intervention. But this is going to depend on a variety of factors, including the Saudi reading of general US approach to the Middle East. I think a détente or a de-escalation in Yemen will go hand in hand with advances on Syria or a better relationship between Riyadh and Washington.
Thanks. Dr. Zhou Eun-kong.
Thank
Could
you.
Stand up. Thanks.
Cho Kong from Shell. I have a general question. There are two competing narratives here. There's the geopolitical confrontation that you talk about. There's also the cosmopolitan cooperation that you say is fading, but we did see Paris COP21 last December dealing with the most important challenge facing us as a global community. And also, while China and the US may confront each other in many areas, they also cooperate on environmental concerns. So can the two proceed in tandem, the two narratives, or will one win through?
Nick?
The view that comes across in the book is narrative one is winning the struggle. And if you look at COP21, which is the example that you cite, it's interesting how different it is from the Kyoto process. Kyoto process, as an essay in the book, which you can reread, makes clear Kyoto was about fixing the climatic impact, and therefore the cost was potentially open-ended. The Paris Agreement fixes the cost and leaves the outcome to some risk. So it's not actually the form of binding international agreement that Kyoto was. It's fundamentally different from that. There's less coercive power behind it.
And the second row here. Thanks.
I don't need a microphone, will you?
No, you do, because we're making certain that the questions are also broadcast in our
William
webcast.
Ward for Il Foglio of Rome and Italian State Radio. Emile Hockey, your very interesting introduction. I noticed you didn't once mention the word Israel. I'm not sure whether that's a good or a bad thing. You did talk about the dominant Iran-Saudi Arabia fault line. I want to ask you about two other states in the Middle East area. Turkey and Egypt, which in some ways seem to have been following very almost converging narratives in recent years or months. What is interesting is that whilst both of them are increasing their close relationships with Moscow at the moment and declining with their relationships with the West, particularly in Turkey's case with NATO, they are locked into a kind of long-lasting enmity, which they seem unable to overcome. I wonder whether you could comment on that, and particularly with regard to the subversive or the opposition elements in both countries, and whether there is any way, and whether Israel can intervene in this conflict in a constructive way of some sort.
Emile.
Certainly, there's no lack of crisis in the Middle East to cover. So yeah, I did not mention Israel, but because if you go around Middle Eastern capitals or Arab capitals and you ask what's on top of your mind and what are you willing to spend political capital or military resources on, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is pretty low on the list. We'll see, actually. But there may be developments in coming weeks. There are rumors that the U.S. may be introducing a resolution at the Security Council precisely on Israel after providing a very generous military assistance package that the Obama administration will also show the stake. That may change things. On your question about Turkey and Egypt, yes, these are two regional powers that are weighted heavily domestically because of internal discontent, a lot of anxiety in the rulership, but at the same time as a lot of assertiveness. I mean, the worst nightmare of Erdogan has come to pass, but he's been able to actually use this to strengthen his domestic position. Erdogan has experienced what he was warning would happen and what had happened in Egypt 3 years before, and people were actually laughing at those kind of warnings where the military, parts of the military, mounted a coup against a civilian, democratically elected government. But these are two countries that are still, their self-image and their regional ambitions remained at odds. In fact, I mean, a couple of countries have tried to broker rapprochement. Saudi Arabia is one, and Russia, I mean, interestingly, is the other. I just think that there's the state of fragmentation in the region is so big that there's no real interest and there's no real return, clear return for these countries. So they're unlikely to engage in a real rapprochement. They're likely to de-escalate. They will stop trashing each other a bit less. They will, resume a certain level of economic cooperation. But that won't amount to, either an alliance or something that can stabilize other parts of the Middle East. Ultimately, they're both focused on their on pretty dire domestic economic conditions and on consolidating their authority.
And the surprise emergence of Khalid Haftar in Libya, do you think that's going to change the game, particularly for al-Sisi?
I mean, there is a longing for the strong man again in the Middle East, and Khalifa Haftar is playing on that. At the same time, he's making military advances, but they don't translate necessarily politically because Libya is so divided. So yes, there is a movement to support him in Egypt and other places in the Middle East. But I doubt this is the solution to Libya. It has to be a real consensus among the various parties. And Haftar is not the person who's going to bring all these factions together.
And in the third row, yes, please.
Metin Güneş from CNN Turk. There is a tension presently between the US and Turkey about the US's support to Kurds in Syria. Do you see some kind of collision course between the US and Turkey over the support for the Kurds of the US against ISIS?
Emil?
The Kurds, the YPG, are seen in Washington as the most reliable and the most effective force against ISIS. And in his final months in power, what President Obama wants to see is essentially an offensive against Raqqa and another one against Mosul. Perhaps not the end of this, but at least the beginning of the end of ISIS control over that. And it's very difficult to see the U.S. Developing relationships or building the capability of other groups. I think they're essentially stuck with the Kurds, or actually with the SDF, which comprises a few Arab factions. But the Kurds really are running the show in Syria. The problem with the anti-ISIS strategy that the U.S. has designed is in a way it's politics free. The U.S. looked for the most efficient military actor without really thinking about how this would play out on the battlefield. And we see a lot of tensions already between Syrian Arabs and Syrian Kurds in many places, which is what Turkey is actually trying to use in terms of its intervention. Turkey does support the main Sunni Arab rebel factions in northern Syria. But the question for Turkey is, what is the ultimate objective? There was a time where, for Turkey, the primary threat was Assad, then the Kurds, then ISIS. Now it's the Kurds, ISIS, Assad. The way, it's very difficult for Ankara right now to convince its international partners of the wisdom of its operation and the extent of it. I mean, will Turkey use its newfound position in northern Syria to pressure the Assad regime more, or is it part of a consensus with Russia, of an agreement with Russia? So the geopolitics are still very fluid, and the United States is not willing to change its strategy for the moment. So we're going to have to wait until 2017 to see if Washington and Ankara can come closer on this. Perhaps there will be too much damage done between now and then. The Kurds have, especially in Syria, have very, very legitimate grievances, and they've been quite reliable forces against ISIS. The guys on the other side, the Syrian rebels, are seen very suspiciously in Washington in particular. So the case for a change in strategy is going to be very difficult to make.
Yes, in the second row. Yes, and then I'll come down. Second row there.
Mohammed Shakil from Statoil. I'll spare Emil and not mention the Middle East. Adam and Nick, we've spoken about the age of US indispensability coming to an end, and then you mentioned the ascendancy of, say, Russia and China. Could you foresee over the coming 12 months of sort of convergence of interest between the two, China and Russia, more sort of convergence on foreign policy going forward, or is it just fundamentally their interests are separate and therefore they will go their separate ways also?
Nick Redmond.
There are interests that converge, and on those already we've seen cooperation. It's quite well established. Look at their voting records at the UN Security Council. They tend to be very similar, but there are fundamental differences of interest there. For Russia in its current slightly troubled state, there is evidently an increased appetite for a closer relationship with China, but China, as far as I can tell, has been fairly transactional.
Transactional and increasingly circumspect, as I mentioned. I think there's a genuine sense of alarm in Beijing about the temper and temperament of Russian foreign policy at the moment, and a sense now that Beijing has some incentive to signal on some issues an independent line so that it doesn't get, as it were, tarnished with the same brush as Russia. I think more generally speaking, this has always been a very unsentimental relationship. There's very little by way of cultural affinity or a sense of historical comity. And I think that'll come more out into the open as the transactional elements of the relationship perhaps begin to become more attenuated.
Thank you. Yes, in the white shirt and the grey. Sorry, two more rows. There you go. Yep.
Thank you. Sam Jones, Financial Times. Two questions, if I may. The first, I'm curious as to your thoughts on the relationship between Putin and Assad and how that has worked out. It seems to have been relatively transactional previously, and there's no love lost between the two. So I'm wondering how current military events have affected that. And secondly, what does the pushback for ISIS and the increasing sort of asymmetry of their tactics mean for their place in the global jihad? And given how easily they seem to have been pushed out of Sirte in Libya, contrary to what people were thinking, I'm curious as to just how deeply the panel thinks their roots have gone down elsewhere around the globe. Thank you.
Emil?
The relationship between Putin and Assad is something we can study mostly from watching the very awkward footage, the videos and the pictures of their meetings, because there is a clear sense that there is a certain hierarchy and sense of authority between the two. So when Assad visited Putin late last year, and then when he welcomed Shoigu in a surprise guest a few months ago, it was always clear that Assad was the more junior partner in here, and there's absolutely no doubt about this. Look, no love lost, yes, probably, but Putin's problem with Assad is more one of performance than principle. It's just that Putin is dismayed that Assad militarily and politically cannot do better. It's not the difference. The difference between them is not about principle. It's not that Putin is outraged about Assad's management of affairs or the use of brutality or or chemical weapons, etc. It's a bit embarrassing. It's a bit problematic, but it's not there doesn't seem to be any question about the alliance between those two countries. Look, there is a sense. Some people basically feel that actually Russia's operation in Syria has not delivered that much. It wasn't that strategic. That the Russian effort has been frustrated, etc. Certainly, there have been operational frustrations, and these are different cultures. And don't forget that Russia has to operate alongside and in support of Iran and Shia militias and others. This is not what Russia likes to do or is accustomed to do. But essentially, that has worked on the ground, and Russia is in a much better position. And I think Putin can rationalize his investment despite the difficulty of dealing with Assad. I would argue it's one that has paid off. In terms of ISIS, I will let Virginia really address the issue of Boko Haram and ISIS pretension to expand, because sometimes ISIS claims affiliates who are not really affiliates. ISIS claim victories and attacks that are not really ISIS engineered, etc. But it's true that ISIS has been weakened in terms of its narrative. I mean, ISIS had two great appealing arguments out there. The first one was that it was winning, expanding, and everyone loves success. And in a way, that was a driver for the numbers of foreign jihadis joining the movement. I mean, the second claim that ISIS was doing is that it was establishing a state, it controlled territory, it was about governance. And suddenly you can't do governance when your sources of income have been really depleted, when your infrastructure has been also debilitated, targeted, when your leadership is on the run, etc. So I do think that ISIS, in terms of its Syrian and Iraqi basis, has been fundamentally shaken. What it does beyond is a different matter. I still think that ISIS has enough appeal among enough people to be a pretty dangerous beast. The question of whether it can build caliphates elsewhere, or the provinces, is a different matter. I mean, they're struggling in Egypt a bit more now than a few months ago. They haven't been able to mount spectacular attacks. Now, perhaps they will mount one tomorrow, and everything I'm saying right now seems irrelevant. That's the element of surprise in this kind of terrorism. But you're right. In Libya, the big fear was that ISIS would create that mini state on the Mediterranean, and a combination of Libyan troops, external support for them, has decisively weakened them. But they went south, and they went closer to Tunisia and Algeria. So that may be the next battlefield.
Virginia Comolli?
Yeah, if we look at the situation in sub-Saharan Africa over the past year and a half or so, we see an attempt by ISIS to increase its influence across the region. I think that the most significant development was the pledge of allegiance by Boko Haram to ISIS, that then the group rebranded itself as ISIS West African Province. Again, I'm very skeptical on the level of cooperation between the two organizations. It's very easy to cooperate on the social media sphere and use similar dissemination channels, but then when it comes to actual operations on the ground is a very different story. In addition, we've also seen in Somalia a number of high-level defections of Al-Shabaab members who had decided to side with ISIS. And we also seen an increasing fractures within the movement, with the younger and foreign elements within Al-Shabaab preferring ISIS as opposed to Al-Shabaab, which has been suffering quite significant losses as a result of the campaign by AMISOM. We've also seen a number of defections in the Sahel and some Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb affiliates operating in Mali and neighboring countries, but again, here is only about individuals who decided to switch their allegiances. Overall, I think that the main area of concern is in Nigeria and to a lesser degree Somalia. The final note on this is that oftentimes when elements within a movement decide to switch allegiance, you end up with fractured groups. For instance, in the case of Boko Haram, we now have the group effectively divided into two factions, one that is part of the ISIS caliphate and one that remains under the original leader Abu Bakr Shekau. This creates increased infighting and even more unstable security pictures, and so usually fractures lead to increase in violence.
Thanks. Yes, I got at the very back from Sky, I think.
Dominic Waghorn, Sky News. The politics of parochialism and some of the other trends that were outlined earlier in your talk, the disenchantment with experts and institutions and rising trends of populism, could all come to a head in 2 months' time. How big an earthquake do you think a Trump victory would be geopolitically for the world?
Yeah. Could I ask Matthew Harris, the managing editor of our journal Survival, which just in the issue that has emerged has a number of articles on the US elections, including on the Trump phenomenon. Matthew, if you could stand up and maybe give your views.
Yeah, thank you. I think this answer should first come with a caveat, which is, of course, it's unclear exactly what a Trump presidency would look like, especially in foreign policy, in the sense that it's unclear who would be in Trump's closest circle of advisors in foreign policy. He's also shown a tendency to change his positions when it suits him. And of course, it's not clear the extent to which Trump himself would focus on foreign policy rather than turning his attention to domestic issues. But I think, even with that caveat in mind, we can say that Trump's nomination by one of the major parties in America is a signal event in American history, whether or not he wins the general election. Part of that is because of his nativism on issues of race and immigration. Part of that is because of his narcissistic personality. But part of that is also his foreign policy. And I think to pick out one trend in particular that was evident in last night's debate, Trump's attitude towards US alliances fits with his self-conception as a business person and appears to be purely transactional. He discusses US alliances in monetary, transactional terms. He referred to NATO last night as a lot of money to pay for protecting other people. This is a radical departure from the policy towards US alliances that are at the bedrock of the current international system. So I think in that sense, a Trump victory would be a major geopolitical earthquake. And I think you saw in Hillary Clinton's response to Trump on this question last night that whether or not Trump wins in November, US allies have heard some of the messages from this campaign and are starting to take those messages into account.
Nick Redman is the editor of the book.
Everything that Matthew said, but we have to be very careful, obviously, applies. But if you simply take the candidates at his words, it does betoken a fundamental change. I'm trying to think, and I cannot recall a historical precedent of a hegemonic power voluntarily casting the crown aside rather than being overtaken by a combination of exhaustion, overstretch, and the rise of a peer rival. So a United States that rips up the global trade rule book that it helped to write, that views its alliances in Europe and Asia in narrow, rather mean actuarial terms, and that no longer promotes values abroad, that's a fundamentally different actor to the one that we've all been familiar with for the past 40, 50 years.
Thank you. Yes, in the penultimate row with the blue shirt, and then we'll come up row by row, if that's all right.
Ashraf Saad from Sky News Arabiya. I've heard a lot here about the Russian effect in Syria and in other parts, but I didn't hear so much about the Iranian effect. So can we hear a little bit more? And also I want to ask about the nuclear deal with Iran, how did it affect Iran's role in the international field? Thank you.
Emir?
Sure. I mean, first, the Iran deal. A lot of people want to blame, the Iran deal for a lot of the bad things that are happening in the region, and a lot of people want to credit the Iran deal for possible openings. My view is very different. I think the Iran deal was a good thing, and in a way, it neutralized a global security problem. But in a way, it's almost irrelevant to Iranian regional policy. Iran was going to push on various regional fronts because it sees itself under attack, but also it is a very opportunistic power. So where it sees openings, it invests in that. I think Iran has demonstrated that it's a very competent actor regionally. It has experience, expertise, and strategic patience in operating in countries undergoing civil strife. These are the qualities, that a country like Saudi Arabia, its rival, doesn't have, which is why Saudi Arabia is struggling quite a lot in its rivalry with Iran right now. At the same time, Iran has suffered. It has suffered in terms of its image regionally and beyond. It has today to send troops, Iranian regular troops and Quds forces and IRGC to fight in Syria. It is exposed regionally. I think still in Tehran, people take the long view. They think they have more strategic patience than their regional rivals, and that they'll ultimately, the promise of Iran will lure key global powers, the US, Russia, European countries, etc. But look, as far as Syria is concerned, I mean, Iran is a prime driver of violence. Iran has stood by Assad and has basically orchestrated the influx of Shia jihadis coming to help Assad. We focus on ISIS and Nusra, which is all fine and fair because these are global jihadi movements. It's also important to realize that the number of Shia jihadis, Lebanese, Iraqis, Pakistanis, Afghans, etc., fighting in Syria is as big, if not bigger, than that of Sunni jihadi. So Iran, in a way, is a senior partner in an alliance that is costly, but the sense, I think, in Tehran is that they're winning, so they can justify the cost. They're willing in the long term. I think a regional and international pushback is needed, but President Obama has prioritized the nuclear deal and the protection of the nuclear deal. So we haven't seen much on that beyond efforts at defense cooperation with the Gulf states. Perhaps the Clinton presidency will be a bit more forceful on this front.
I think we'll just, we have two more questions and then we'll close that. Yes?
Abdullah Hamouda, journalist. There has been a different security assessment to various incidents which took place this year. One of them was the Egyptian Sharm el-Sheikh flight explosion. The second one is the Brussels airport. The third is the coup attempt in Turkey. And in every incident, except the Egyptian one, flights continued to the country concerned, and the Belgium airport, Brussels airport, remained working. And this gives some ground for some people who think that the lack of the return of flights to Sharm el-Sheikh may be an attempt to exert pressure on President Sisi and Egypt because of other policy lines which Egypt adopts, either in Egypt or in the region. How do you see the situation in Egypt, and whether there is a political ground for exerting pressure?
No, I think the short answer to the principal question that you pose is that in our judgment, the decision by a number of countries and airlines to cease flights to Sharm el-Sheikh was taken on narrow and specific security grounds and was not inspired by a wider political agenda. Perhaps we'll leave it there. One more. Did you want some? No? All right. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. The book is available, as is our formal remarks. Thank you very much.